My name is Linda Walker. I am 69 years old, and if you had asked me just a year ago, I would have told you I had lived a long, steady life. I worked as a nurse for more than 4 decades, the kind of job that takes your weekends, your sleep, and sometimes even your hope. But I did it proudly because I had one reason to keep pushing through: my son, Daniel. I raised him alone after his father walked out when Daniel was still a boy. Every night, I told myself the sacrifices would be worth it, that one day he would stand tall and I would know it was all for something. I used to believe the worst pain I could ever witness had already passed through my hands in hospital rooms. Patients losing battles, families holding on to their last words. But nothing prepared me for the heartbreak that came from within my own walls. It did not come in one dramatic moment. It slipped in quietly, like a shadow that you don't notice until it swallows the room. For weeks, my security cameras had been broken, and I felt uneasy every time I went to bed. Finally, I had a technician come out. He fixed them and installed an app on my phone so I could check the house from anywhere. It felt like a small comfort, a little piece of control in a world where I was starting to feel slower, older, a bit more fragile. I had no idea how quickly that simple repair would change everything. The very next morning, Daniel and his wife, Melissa, told me they were heading out. He said he had a job interview. She claimed she was going grocery shopping. I sat in the kitchen with my tea, curious to test out the new app, just to see if the cameras were working. When I tapped the screen, I expected to see an empty living room. Instead, I froze. My son and daughter-in-law were sitting there, my personal papers spread across the coffee table as if my home had turned into their office. I leaned closer, hoping it was just a misunderstanding. But as I listened, the truth cut deeper than any scalpel I had ever held in my career. That was the moment I realized I wasn't simply being overlooked or misunderstood. I was being erased, and that discovery was only the beginning. When I saw Daniel and Melissa rifling through my private papers, my mind went spiraling backward through the years. I couldn't help but remember how our story began. Because in that moment, I kept asking myself, how did we get here? How did the boy I poured my life into become the man planning to steal it from me? Daniel was only 6 years old when his father left. There was no warning, no goodbye, just silence where a partner should have been. I was left standing in a small Charleston house with a half-empty savings account and a little boy who looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. I knew I had to become both mother and father, comfort and protector, provider and guide. So I worked. I took every shift the hospital offered me overnights, back-to-backs, weekends when most people were sitting at backyard barbecues. I would leave before the sun came up and come home just as it was setting, sometimes slipping off my shoes at the door so I wouldn't wake him. There were mornings I stood in front of the mirror, trying to hide the dark circles under my eyes before heading back out. My body ached, but I told myself it was worth it. He would never go without. I remember birthdays where I could only afford store-bought cakes with plain white frosting. But Daniel would look at me with the biggest smile and say it was the best cake in the world. I lived for those moments. On late nights, when I sat on the kitchen floor patching up his scraped knees or helping him glue together a science project, he used to hug me tight and whisper that I was his hero. Those words carried me through the loneliest seasons of my life. Men came and went, kind faces that sometimes offered companionship, but I always turned away, telling myself love could wait. Stability for Daniel could not. I thought if I gave him everything, every ounce of my strength, and every beat of my heart, he would grow into a man who valued loyalty and honesty above all else. When he finally met Melissa, I told myself she was the missing piece. She was charming at first, sweet smiles, polite words, the kind of daughter-in-law every mother hopes for. I welcomed her like my own. When they said they wanted to move in with me to take better care of me, I believed them. At 69, with retirement settling in and the weight of years pressing on my shoulders, I thought it might be comforting to have company in the house. But things shifted slowly, like paint peeling from the walls. Melissa took over the finances, insisting she could manage them better. Daniel grew distant, more impatient, brushing me off when I asked simple questions. They started treating my pension like their allowance. Every month, I set aside $800 for them. Money I thought was an act of generosity, something to help them breathe easier. In my mind, it was peace money, a way to avoid conflict. But one afternoon, I overheard them laughing, calling it crumbs. That word stung more than they will ever know. Crumbs. The money I stretched from a modest pension, the result of decades of hard labor, had been reduced to nothing more than scraps in their mouths. Still, I brushed it aside, telling myself they were young, stressed, maybe just careless with their words. That is what mothers do. We make excuses for the people we love. Yet as I sat with those memories, watching them on the camera screen, I realized how blind love can make us. I thought my sacrifices were a shield that would protect me forever. Instead, those very sacrifices had turned into weapons they now used to diminish me. The boy who once told me I was his hero was now a man who measured my worth in dollars and dismissed my gifts as crumbs. And Melissa, the woman I once embraced as a daughter, was now sharpening the knife with every controlling decision she made. That morning when I caught them in the living room, it was not just about papers or deeds. It was about the bond I thought we shared, unraveling thread by thread. And deep inside, a voice whispered to me that this betrayal was only the beginning of something far darker. The morning I truly understood what Daniel and Melissa were planning still feels like a nightmare I cannot fully wake from. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my tea, the phone beside me glowing with the camera app. I thought the room would be empty. Instead, the image filled with my son pacing back and forth, running his hands through my neatly stacked folders, while Melissa sat calmly on the couch, flipping through my papers like she owned them. My chest tightened as I realized they weren't just curious. They were hunting. Melissa spoke with a sharpness that made it clear this wasn't a casual search. She was demanding the original deed to my home. Daniel's response pierced me. He said I always kept everything organized, that all they had to do was keep digging. He wasn't describing me with affection anymore. He was describing my habits as weaknesses to be exploited. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, but the evidence kept piling up in front of me. Melissa mentioned a man named Anthony, someone I remembered meeting briefly, a slick smile, the kind of charm that unsettles you the second you see it. Now I understood why he had lingered in my memory. He was the one preparing the forgery. Then Melissa held up one of my documents to the light and smiled. She spoke with excitement about how much the house was worth, how it could be sold for over $5,000. And in that moment, I stopped being a person in their eyes. I was reduced to an obstacle, an old woman they planned to move into a tiny one-bedroom apartment for my last years. Those words, my last years, echoed in my chest like a cruel countdown. Daniel muttered about tricking me if I refused to sign. He said I had been confused lately, that I probably wouldn't notice. Confused, I admit. Sometimes I forget where I set down my glasses, or I lose track of the date. But that doesn't mean I am incapable. They were using my age as a weapon, building a story to convince others I wasn't in control of my own life. Melissa leaned toward him, pressing the point even harder. She reminded him of their future, of the family they wanted, and dismissed the $800 I gave them each month as crumbs. I could almost feel the blood drain from my face when I heard it again. Crumbs! That word had become the anthem of their resentment. I sat there frozen, tea shaking in my hand, realizing that the people I had trusted most were plotting to erase me from my own life. At first, grief swallowed me whole. I thought about the little boy who once clung to my hand at the playground, who once cried when I left for night shifts, who once told me I was his hero. How could that boy grow into a man willing to betray me like this? But as the minutes passed, my grief hardened into something else, a quiet, simmering resolve. They thought they were clever, speaking freely while I was only a room away. They thought I was blind to their whispers, that I was too old, too frail, too trusting. What they didn't know was that every word was being captured. Every scheme was becoming evidence. Still, I had to face an even more painful truth. Their betrayal didn't stop at greed. They began building a narrative around me, carefully planting seeds in places that mattered. Daniel called our family doctor, painting me as paranoid, claiming I believed they were conspiring against me. Melissa chimed in, saying I talked to myself, repeated questions, forgot things more often than not. They were crafting an image of me as a woman slipping into decline. A woman who couldn't possibly be trusted with her own affairs. It was the cruelest twist of all. My vigilance was being turned against me, rewritten as paranoia. My careful habits, once a source of pride, were being twisted into evidence of incompetence. They were preparing not only to steal my home, but also to take my dignity, my independence, my very identity. I refused to let them succeed. That morning, as I watched them plot and scheme, I realized I could no longer be just a mother making excuses. I had to become something else. I had to become an investigator in my own home, a silent witness collecting proof. And deep inside, I knew I would not face this alone. Once I realized what Daniel and Melissa were capable of, something inside me shifted. I could no longer afford to be just the mother who made excuses, brushing away cruelty as stress or youthful carelessness. If I wanted to keep my dignity, my home, and the life I had built with decades of labor, I had to become deliberate. I had to play their game, but I had to play it better. The first step was simple, yet terrifying. I called my longtime physician, Dr. Harris, and asked for a private appointment. I told her what was happening in my home, that my son and his wife were trying to portray me as paranoid, even unstable. She listened quietly, and then she suggested something that made my stomach twist a full cognitive evaluation. For a moment, I hesitated. What if I failed? What if, despite my clarity, the tests revealed something I didn't want to face? But then I reminded myself that truth could only protect me. So I agreed. The tests were long memory exercises, problem-solving, reasoning tasks, questions meant to trip up the foggy or distracted mind. I answered each one slowly, carefully, feeling the weight of my future balanced on every response. When it was over, Dr. Harris smiled at me. She told me my mind was sharper than most people 10 years younger, and she documented it all in a formal report. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled. They could spin stories and whisper lies. But now, I had proof. That piece of paper became my armor. But I knew words alone would not be enough. I needed undeniable evidence, something so clear that even the most skeptical judge would see the truth. That was when Dr. Harris referred me to Richard Lawson, a private investigator. He was calm, professional, and sadly, far too familiar with cases like mine. He explained that what I was experiencing was financial elder abuse, and it happened more often than people wanted to admit. His words made me feel less alone. Richard brought a technician to my home. Together, they installed hidden cameras in the living and dining rooms, so small that even I couldn't find them again once they were in place. He gave me a tiny microphone, no larger than a button, that could clip beneath my blouse. All I had to do, he said, was live as I normally did. Let them talk. Let them reveal themselves. My heart pounded at the thought, but I nodded. If they wanted me to play the role of the confused old woman, I would play it to perfection. From that day on, I lived two lives, to Daniel and Melissa. I was still the soft-spoken mother who asked for help with groceries, who nodded politely when they explained the bills in condescending tones, who smiled when they kissed my cheek on their way out. But in my private thoughts, I was a detective. Every word they spoke, every sigh, every impatient glance became another piece of the puzzle. Late at night, I would sit in my bedroom, watching the camera feeds glow on my phone, writing notes in a spiral notebook, memorizing their schemes. Fear never left me. At times, it clung so tightly I could feel it pressing into my ribs. But that fear sharpened into determination. My house, my life, my dignity, none of it would be taken without a fight. I reminded myself that I had worked nights in emergency rooms, holding my composure while lives slipped away in front of me. If I could survive that, I could survive this. I was both a nurse and a mother, calm under pressure, resilient beyond measure. Just when I thought I had their plan figured out, they shifted tactics. They realized tricking me into signing papers might not be enough. Instead, they started shaping a narrative that I was unstable, paranoid, and unfit to manage my affairs. It was a cruel strategy, because it turned my vigilance into ammunition for them. Every time I asked too many questions, Melissa rolled her eyes and sighed as if I were losing touch. Every time I double-checked a bill, Daniel muttered that I was overthinking. I could see them laying the groundwork, preparing to declare me incompetent. I remember one night, sitting alone in my room, listening to them whisper in the hallway. They spoke about deadlines, about Anthony needing the deed soon, about how to pressure me into compliance. Daniel sounded anxious, but Melissa was cold, calculating, reminding him of the future they wanted. They thought I was asleep, unaware. In reality, I was recording every word. That was the second turning point for me. Their betrayal no longer shocked me. It fueled me. I realized their arrogance was my greatest advantage. They underestimated me. They thought age made me weak. They believed love made me blind. But they were wrong. Every sigh, every insult, every whispered plan was becoming the rope they would eventually hang themselves with. I began to prepare my own performance. If they wanted me to appear forgetful, I let my questions trail off at just the right moments. If they wanted me to look naive, I widened my eyes and nodded as if I didn't understand. Every move I made was calculated, not just for survival, but for the trap I was building. It was exhausting, carrying the weight of 2 lives at once. But there was a fire inside me I had not felt in years. I was no longer just defending myself. I was setting the stage, and I knew that when the curtain finally rose, Daniel and Melissa would not be ready for the show I had planned, because the day was coming when I would let them believe they had won. And in that very moment, the truth would strike like lightning. The day I chose to spring the trap felt strangely ordinary. The sun poured through the windows, and the house smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. But beneath that calm exterior, I knew the storm was waiting. I told Daniel and Melissa that I was finally ready to review the documents they had been pushing toward me for weeks. I watched their faces light up, and it was almost painful to see how easily they revealed their greed. They thought they were on the edge of victory, that the stubborn old woman had finally given up. In reality, every smile, every nod, every nervous glance of theirs would soon be recorded for the evidence it truly was. Melissa rushed to gather the papers, smoothing the pages with a confidence that reminded me of a dealer shuffling cards before a rigged game. Daniel placed a pen beside them, his voice calm on the surface, but his hands restless, betraying his nerves. I adjusted my blouse carefully, feeling the small microphone clipped beneath the fabric. The hidden cameras Richard had installed were already watching from the corners of the room. I sat at the dining table, my heart steady in my chest. I had prepared myself for this moment, rehearsed it in silence, whispered it into the stillness of my bedroom at night. They began guiding me through the documents, speaking slowly, as if I were a child in need of simple explanations. I asked what certain words meant, pretending to squint at the small print. Melissa brushed my concerns aside with impatience, saying it was all standard legal language. She assured me it was only about protecting me. But inside, my thoughts burned. Protecting me, or protecting themselves, I set the pen down and looked directly at my son. For the first time, I saw not the boy I raised, but the man who believed I was nothing more than a stepping stone. Melissa leaned closer, her tone growing sharp. She spoke of the future, of selling the house, of moving me into a smaller place. I listened quietly, letting her conviction tighten around her like a noose she did not even realize she was wearing. Then Daniel slipped. Frustration cracked through his calm. He said they deserved that money, that they had lived on crumbs long enough, that the house should be theirs by right. His words struck like cold steel. By right. My 30 years of labor, my nights without sleep, my sacrifices had been twisted into some imagined debt they believed I owed them. I felt the sadness wash over me, but it was not weakness, it was clarity. I told myself that this was the final unveiling, the moment they showed the world who they truly were. Melissa, unshaken, went even further. She warned that if I refused to sign, they would have no choice but to declare me incompetent. She said the paperwork was already prepared. That was the moment I let the silence stretch, letting them feel as though the victory was theirs. And then, with a calmness I had been building for weeks, I smiled. I told myself, let them believe it. Let them lean into their arrogance one last time. And then it happened. The sound of the front door opening broke the heavy air. Detective Richard Lawson stepped inside, followed closely by 2 uniformed officers and my attorney. The room shifted instantly, Melissa's face drained of color, while Daniel froze, his pen still hovering over the papers. The officers moved swiftly, reading out charges of conspiracy, forgery, and elder financial abuse. My son's eyes went wide, and for a moment, I almost saw the little boy he used to be, terrified and pleading. He begged me with his eyes not to let this happen. But I held firm. I reminded myself of every sacrifice, every insult, every plan they had made to strip me of my life. Melissa fought against the officer's grip, spitting words of justification, insisting they had cared for me, lived with me, helped me. But I knew the truth. They had circled me like vultures, waiting for the moment to strike. They hadn't offered care. They had been calculating how to profit from my death long before it came. As the officers led them out of the house, a deep quiet settled in. The walls, which had echoed with whispers of betrayal, suddenly felt lighter. For the first time in months, I could breathe. I could stand in my own home without feeling hunted. It wasn't joy I felt in that moment, but strength. The kind of strength that comes from knowing you faced the storm and refused to be swept away. But even as relief coursed through me, I understood one thing clearly. This was not the end of the story. The legal battles, the questions from neighbors, the weight of explaining how a mother could turn her son in, those were still waiting. And yet, I felt ready, because when you have already walked through betrayal this deep, the truth no longer scares you, it frees you. After Daniel and Melissa were taken away, the house felt both silent and alive. For months, it had been a place where I walked on eggshells, afraid of what I might overhear or discover next. Now, the walls seemed to breathe again, free from the weight of betrayal. The legal process unfolded slowly, as these things often do. My attorney guided me through it with patience. In the end, Daniel and Melissa surrendered any claim to my property and agreed to stay away permanently. They served prison time 18 months instead of the decade they could have faced. Some people asked me if I regretted pressing charges, if perhaps I had been too harsh on my only son. But the truth is, I did not regret it. What I regretted was waiting so long to believe what my eyes and ears were already telling me. Motherhood teaches us to forgive, to overlook, to excuse. But motherhood does not mean destroying yourself to protect those who are harming you. That was the hardest lesson of all. Life now is quieter, but not lonely. I tend my garden in the mornings, pulling weeds and planting flowers the way I once patched knees and packed lunches. I share meals with neighbors who have become my chosen family. I laugh more often than I thought I would after everything, because peace has a way of making room for joy again. Sometimes, when I sit in my favorite chair by the window, I think about Daniel as a boy. I remember the sound of his laughter when he chased fireflies in the yard, the way he clung to me on the first day of school, the pride in his eyes when he graduated. Those memories still live inside me, and they are mine to keep. But I no longer confuse memory with loyalty. Love does not excuse betrayal. Blood is not the only thing that defines family. Respect does. Honesty does. Genuine love does. And if those things are missing, then all that remains is a bond of biology, not of the heart. I know there are people listening who may be facing their own battles within their families. Maybe you've been dismissed, manipulated, or treated as less than the sacrifices you've made. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: your dignity matters. Your peace matters. Do not let anyone convince you that age or kindness makes you weak. Sometimes protecting yourself means making painful choices. even if it means letting go of the people you thought you loved the most. If my story has touched you, I invite you to share it with someone who might need courage today. Leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I would love to know how far this story travels, and if you believe stories like mine deserve to be heard. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. From my heart to yours, thank you for spending this time with me.